This week's case is about the Yosemite killer who was active in 1999 and killed 4 women. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, my name is Brandy and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery, along with one or more of my fabulous felines. If you are a returning subscriber, welcome back my feline friends, and a big shout out to my feline fans who help support this channel. I'm not in my regular spot. As I mentioned in my post on YouTube, our basement finally got finished after 8 long months. Yay! But we're in the middle of moving everything back down to the basement, and so of course my usual filming spot is just filled with like boxes and clutter. So here I am in my office. Forgive me if a cat does walk by. I will make sure they get on camera. So this case is sort of like a part 2 from last week's case. Last week we talked about Robert Parnell, who kidnapped 7-year-old Steven Stayner and kept him for 7 years before Steven was able to escape. Unfortunately, that case did not have a lot of happy endings, and one of those unhappy endings was Steven's older brother Cary, who kind of went off the deep end. So let's dive in and talk about Cary Stayner. Cary Stayner was born August 13th, 1961 in Merced, California. He was one of 5 children from Kay and Dell. There were 2 boys and 3 girls. Now the family struggled financially, so that was hard, but there was also talk that there was some multi-generational abuse going on because Kay herself had been abused as a child, and it seemed to kind of pass down the generation. Now Dell, the father, he obviously looked at his son Steven like that was the apple of his eye. That was his favorite son, and Cary noticed this. But regardless, Cary and Steven shared a very close bond and relationship with each other because they were the only brothers in the family. In 1972, when Cary was 11 years old, his younger brother Steven, was kidnapped, and Steven would not escape captivity until 7 years later. Now, Cary had a hard time during the 7 years while his brother was missing. Cary would claim that he felt neglected by his parents while they searched for Steven and, obsessed over finding Steven. And so he pretty much had to fend from himself from ages 11 to 18. Now, plus Cary himself missed Steven, and that bond was severed, so he was struggling with that as well. Cary also felt that there was an implication that by the family that because Cary was the oldest, the big brother, that he didn't do enough to protect his little brother Steven. And so he felt a bit like maybe the kidnapping was his fault. To further build on that, his parents would tell Cary that, he really needed to look out for his younger sisters and help protect them. So there was a lot of responsibility he felt was being put on him at a pretty young age. So during this time that his brother was missing, he just was really withdrawn, depressed, and he started isolating within himself. Now, Steven's kidnapping may have been kind of like the catalyst that started Cary down a dark road, but when Cary was age 7, he had admitted that he had begun having fantasies about tying up women and torturing them. Now, many will say that he got this idea somewhere. It just didn't manifest out of thin air, but it was never clear who or what put that into his head. Now, in 1980, when Cary was 19 years old, his younger brother Steven escaped from his captor and came back home. When Steven escaped, he also had a 5-year-old boy in tow that he rescued from the same child predator. Steven, of course, became like this national hero. He not only escaped from his captor, but he saved a little boy in the process. There were books and movies and even a statue erected in Steven's honor. Cary is watching his little brother Steven now getting all this attention from, his parents and really the entire world at this point. Cary was a little bit jealous, but he was glad Steven was home. Now, Cary stated that what really made him rage and made him angry was when Steven and their parents, Kay and Dell, went on the Good Morning America show. Cary stated that he was watching the show and all he was seeing was his father, Dell, constantly hugging Steven and giving him all this affection, something Cary himself never experienced from his father. Cary also felt that he was losing his identity, so to speak. He felt like he was no longer Cary Stayner, that he was Steven Stayner's big brother. Steven, the one who got kidnapped and escaped and is now a hero. So he felt that he was losing his identity in that way as well. So even though Cary and Steven could not be, they couldn't get that bond back that they had as kids. They weren't as close as they were as kids. They still got along for the most part and were brothers. However, in 1989, Steven would be killed in a motorcycle accident at 24 years old. Cary was, of course, devastated by this of losing his brother. Again, he further spiraled downward. Now, at the time of Steven's death, Cary was living with his uncle Jesse because they both worked at the same company. Cary's uncle Jesse would be found dead a year after Steven's death in 1990 with a gunshot to the chest. Now, it appeared to authorities, or at least the narrative given to authorities, that it was an attempted robbery by a drifter of some sort, but no one was ever identified. Now, Cary was considered a suspect for a short time and was questioned. Cary would tell authorities that during the time that Steven was kidnapped, he himself was sexually abused by his uncle Jesse. But Cary was adamant that he didn't shoot him. Now, no charges were ever filed on anyone in Jesse's death, and the case is still considered unsolved to this day. In 1991, Cary attempted to take his own life by carbon monoxide poisoning, but he did fail at that attempt. So after all of these roller coaster moments in Cary's life, as the years went on, he seemed to get a little bit better. Cary had a good job at a mirror company, and he was well liked by his coworkers, and they trusted him. He was just a normal guy to them. All seemed fine on the surface. However, below the surface, Cary was still having issues with his anger and fighting these demons that he battled since he was a kid. One day in 1995, Cary's anger bubbled over and he ran outside of his work and just started punching a piece of wood over and over till his knuckles were all bloody. And he was yelling how he wanted to kill this coworker of his for something that they did. Cary was sent to a mental hospital over this incident because people were really worried about him. But the therapist believed that Cary was okay, that this was just a one-time event where everything just got to him, and so he offered him a few ways to cope in the future, and he was released pretty quickly from the mental hospital. Now, around this time, his parents, Dell and Kay, decided they were ready to move away. You know, they had stayed in that house in Merced, California, waiting for Steven to come home. Steven did come home, and then they lost Steven to a motorcycle accident, so they were just ready to move on. So now, Cary was losing his parents. Steven was gone, his Uncle Jesse was gone, and now his parents were leaving as well. So Cary felt more alone than ever. Cary ended up quitting his job at the mirror company, you know, a job that he held for some time and was really good at. So it was, you know, an unusual move for him. So Cary decided that he just wanted to live off grid. He didn't want the, 9 to 5 rat race and everything, that he was just going to go live in the wilderness for a while. And so he did. He went to Yosemite Park and spent a lot of time just in the woods. Now, by 1997, Cary, of course, needed money, and so he had been hired as a handyman at a local motel inside of Yosemite Park. So he could still go hiking and be in the wilderness as much as possible, but also have a little money coming in. He also had a place to stay because working as a handyman at the hotel, he was offered a room to rent. Now, this hotel wasn't small by no means. It was probably medium sized. It had about 50 rooms, and so it kept Cary busy but not overwhelmed. He still had a lot of free time. So Cary is enjoying just living in the beautiful Yosemite Park, doing his handyman work when needed, and he is again being friends with his coworkers. Everybody likes him. He just seems like a normal guy. But again, Cary was still fighting that anger inside of him. And around this time, he started using marijuana very heavily as well. Cary would state that the only way he could clear his head and cope was to go hiking in Yosemite Park. So, of course, he would continue to spend a lot of time in the wilderness. And during this time, he found that he liked being nude in the wilderness. So he did a lot of nude sunbathing and just being one with nature. Now, Cary around this time becomes convinced that Bigfoot is real, and he becomes obsessed with finding Bigfoot. Now, there have been psychologists that stated that Cary's obsession with Bigfoot, in a sense, was his own way of finding out this monster inside of him and trying to, understand what is going on inside of him. That Cary was doing all he could to keep this monster in check from coming out and, scaring everybody. So he was out Bigfoot hunting a lot. Now, by the end of 1998, it's believed that Cary was coming apart at the seams. That this, monster was coming out of him and cracks began to show. On February 14th, 1999, this was a slow time for the tourists that would come through Yosemite Park. So Cary was working at the hotel, and he saw 3 women pull into the parking lot in a rented car. There was Carol Sund, who was 42 years old, her daughter Julie Sund, who was 15 years old, and Julie's friend Sylvania Peloso, who was 16 years old. Now, these 3 women were the only occupants of the hotel at the time because of the slow tourist season. Cary's dark urges bubbled over, and they were too much to ignore. He was going to jump at this opportunity to finally play out his fantasy. So around 11 p.m. that night, Cary knocked on the 3 women's hotel room door and stated that they had a leak in their bathroom and he was the maintenance man to fix it. Carol, who, was older and wiser, became a little suspicious and went and checked the bathroom, told Cary through the door, "There is no leak, we're fine, thank you, good night." However, Cary was very convincing through the door and asked her to say, "Look, I just need to come in and look. If there's no leak, great, but if there is a leak, I could lose my job if I don't fix it." Unfortunately, Carol would end up opening the door and letting Cary the monster in. As soon as Cary was inside the room, he pulled out a gun and pointed it at 3 women. He ordered the 2 teenagers, Julie and Sylvania, into the bathroom and barricaded the door. He then would strangle Carol to death. He would take her body out to their rented car and put it in the trunk. He then returned to the room and attempted to sexually assault the 2 teenagers. However, Sylvania, she was not cooperating. She was fighting him off. She started screaming, and unfortunately, Cary then killed her. He then took her body out and put it in the trunk of the car as well. He then returned to the room where Julie was the only one left, and for the next several hours he would sexually assault and torture her. In the early morning hours the next day, Cary would take Julie and put her into the rented car with her mom and her friend dead in the trunk. And Cary would then drive 90 miles to a remote area called Don Pedro Reservoir Outlook. As the sun was coming up, he would take Julie out of the car and put her on the hillside and watch the sunrise. After the sunrise was over, Cary would then slit her throat and leave her for dead right there on the hillside. Cary would then dump the car a few miles away with the two dead bodies still in the trunk, and then he would call a cab. The cab came and picked him up and took him the 90 miles back to Yosemite Park. Once back at the hotel, Cary cleaned the room of any evidence, and he went back to work like nothing ever happened. Now, after a couple days went by, Carol's husband had come looking for Carol, his daughter, and the friend. Cary got into his head that maybe he didn't cover his tracks good enough. So he found time and he went back the 90 miles to the Don Pedro Reservoir where he dumped the car, and he decided to further destroy evidence. So he removed any evidence out of the car, and then he poured gasoline all over the car and lit it on fire. He also had taken Carol's wallet with her ID in it, and he drove it in the opposite direction of the hotel to Modesto, California, which is about 6 miles away, and he just threw it out a window. He did that to throw off any suspicion that if the cops started come looking, they're going to think that the killers took off to Modesto instead of back at the hotel. Now, Carol's husband had officially reported the women missing, and searches had begun trying to find the women. 4 days after the women were officially reported missing, somebody did find Carol's wallet in Modesto, California. Now, finding this wallet, they realized that this was foul play and that these women were in danger or already dead. So authorities started focusing on trying to find the rental car. Authorities did know that the 3 women did stay at the hotel in Yosemite Park, and so all the staff that worked there were questioned, including Cary. Now, Cary was very stoic and cooperative, and so there was no suspicion on him whatsoever. A month after the women disappeared, a man who was hunting in the woods actually came across the rental car that was burned. Carol and Sylvania's bodies were still in the trunk, but they were so badly decomposed and burnt that they had to use DNA testing to positively identify them. Now, authorities were able to pick up several suspects that they thought maybe were responsible for the women's murders. And they were robbers, transients, even some drug dealers. But they weren't able to make anything stick. They didn't have the proper evidence to be yes, you did this. Now, Cary, who was being very helpful with investigators, he showed them around the hotel. He answered all their questions. And in their mind, he was the furthest away from being a suspect. Cary enjoyed this attention that the authorities were giving him as being such a helpful guy. Now, Julie's body, because Julie was a couple miles away from the burnt car, her body hadn't been found yet. And so Cary, wanting to keep this helpfulness going, he decided to write an anonymous letter to the authorities telling them exactly where to find Julie's body. He even included a map so they could get right down to where she was at. So 2 weeks after the car was found, authorities took this anonymous letter and map, and they found Julie's body on the hillside. Her throat had been cut so badly, she was almost decapitated. So by June of 1999, all 3 women's bodies were found, and authorities were trying to find more evidence of what happened to these women. You see, they had a couple drug dealers in custody that were being held, and they were convinced that these drug dealers were the killers, and they were just trying to get all that evidence together to link them to the crime. Meanwhile, Cary is going on about his life with no suspicion in the world on him. So Cary is now beginning to feel very confident about himself, and it's been a couple months since those murders, and the high he felt on doing what he did was wearing off. So he decided he was going to do another attack. So on July 21st, 1999, Cary came across another opportunity. See, he was in this certain area of Yosemite Park Bigfoot hunting when he saw 26-year-old Joey Armstrong. Joey worked inside Yosemite Park as like a park worker, and she actually lived inside the park. So he spotted her kind of loading stuff into her car outside of her house. When Cary realized that she was alone, he approached her and at gunpoint forced her inside her house. While inside, he duct taped her hands and her mouth, and then he forced her inside his own car. Cary started driving away, and shortly after he started driving away, Joy was able to jump from the car and she just started running. Unfortunately, because she was bound in the duct tape, she couldn't run very fast, and Cary easily caught up to her. Cary then would attack her right there on the spot and actually decapitate her, and then just left her where she lied in the woods. The next day, on July 22nd, Joey's body was found, and authorities began to realize that the drug dealers that they had in custody, they were wrong. They were probably not the killers, that the killer was still out there committing crimes. Now, this time Cary messed up. Witnesses state that they saw a 1979 International Scout parked outside of Joey's house the day before. When they looked further into this car, they realized that this car could be traced back to Cary Stayner, the maintenance man at the hotel in Yosemite Park. Now, Cary was questioned again by authorities, but this time it wasn't about what do you know, it's this has been connected to you, you need to tell us what's going on. The authorities would take pictures of Cary's car, and they would take tire impressions to try to match back to the crime scene. But they didn't arrest Cary at this time. They just took the evidence and said they'd be in touch. So of course, after this questioning, Cary fled. Now, fortunately, Cary's not very good at hiding, and they found him just a couple days later on July 24th. Cary was staying at the Laguna del Sol nudist camp in Wilton, California. Someone at the nudist camp saw Cary's picture on the news and had called authorities. So Cary was taken into custody, and when that happened, all these news stations were alerted. One specific reporter was able to get an interview with Cary after some persistence. Cary would end up confessing to the news reporter before confessing to the authorities. But what shocked them is he not only confessed to Joey's murder, he also confessed that he was the one that murdered Carol, Julie, and Sylvania. He told the reporter that the reason he was confessing is because he wanted a movie made about him. See, his younger brother Steven had a movie made about him, so he wanted one as well. And then he tried to sweeten the deal by saying all the proceeds of the movie can go to the victims' families. Now, Cary would end up denying that he sexually assaulted any of the women or tortured them, despite the evidence to the contrary. Ultimately, Cary wanted to take credit for the murders, but there was a feeling that he was ashamed on how those murders were carried out. When the reporter asked Cary what he would like to say to the victims' families, Cary would just simply respond, "Tell them I'm sorry that their family members were in the right place at the wrong time." Cary went on to admit that, he did have these urges since he was 7 years old. And one psychologist stated that Cary almost wanted to be seen as a hero himself, that in his mind, he had fought these dark urges ever since he was 7 years old, and he never acted on them until now, of course. So people should, be grateful and see him as a hero for, holding off for that long. Now, during the trial, Cary would plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Cary's lawyers brought up, family history of sexual abuse, mental illness, of course, the trauma from Steven's kidnapping. And a doctor took the stand and testified that Cary suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, mild autism, and paraphilia, which is the intense sexual arousal of atypical objects, situations, or fantasies. Cary was ultimately found sane, and he was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder in December of 2002. Cary was sentenced to receive the death penalty for these crimes. Cary is still on death row at the San Quentin Penitentiary in California. See, there have been no executions in California since 2006 due to a court filing regarding flaws in how capital punishment was carried out. We don't know if he'll ever be executed or not. California is still working that out. But Cary is now 60 years old. Now, most experts have said that it's unlikely that Carol, Julie, and Sylvania were Cary's first victims. Usually, a killer like this will not take on 3 women for their first time. He may have attacked women before this, but either they didn't report it, or authorities are just not able to, tie Cary to these long dormant crimes. Some believe Cary's first murder was actually his Uncle Jesse, that he shot him in the chest, but he got away with it due to lack of evidence. What do you think? I would love to hear what your thoughts are down below. If you'd like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to become a feline fan, please hit that join button for special perks. Hope you enjoyed this part 2, and I will see you next Friday. Thanks, guys. Bye.